Today we are going to begin our conversation about civil liberties. So in understanding what civil liberties are, let's just look at the word liberty for a moment. Whenever we talk about the word liberty, we are talking about freedom from something. And when we talk about civil liberty, we're talking about freedom from government. That's specifically what civil liberties are. They are freedoms from government. And most of our civil liberties are protected by the Bill of Rights. For example, the First Amendment protects our freedom of speech. But the first thing that I want you to understand about our civil liberties is that none of them are absolute. In other words, all of our civil liberties have limits. And the reason that all of our civil liberties have limits is because our Constitution does a lot of different things. We've talked about some of those things so far in this class. For example, we know that the Constitution creates government. Remember, we've said the First Amendment creates Congress, the Second Amendment creates the presidency, the Third Amendment creates the federal court system and the Supreme Court. So we know that the Constitution itself creates government. The Constitution also grants different powers to government. We've talked about, for Congress, enumerated powers. We've also talked about implied powers. We've talked about the different powers of the presidency. And all of those exist within the Constitution as well. The Constitution also protects equality. So, finally, it protects liberty. So, there's this one document that does several different things. And within all of these different things that the Constitution does, there are what we call different constitutional values. So the Constitution sort of sets forth, you could say, these different values. For example, there's the value of public safety that's protected through our Constitution. There's the value of democracy that's protected by our Constitution. There's the value of equality that's protected in our Constitution. There's the value of national security that's protected by our Constitution. And then also, again, there's the value of liberty that's within our Constitution. And so the reason that none of our civil liberties are absolute, in other words, why they all have limits, is because sometimes these constitutional values come into conflict with one another. So here's a very easy demonstration of those values coming into conflict. So, for example, our Constitution protects the value, as we just said, of liberty. Within that value of liberty is the idea, which is enshrined in the Second Amendment, that we have the right to keep and bear arms. That's explicitly outlined in the Bill of Rights. Well, our Constitution also protects this value of national security and public safety. Now, if I had an unending right to keep and bear arms, well, then shouldn't I also have the right to own a nuclear missile and have it kept in my garage? If the Second Amendment were not absolute, well, then I should have the right to have a nuclear missile, because a nuclear missile is an arm, just like a gun is an arm. But me keeping a nuclear missile would very clearly come into conflict with the value of national security and the value of public safety. So it makes sense that my right or my freedom or my liberty to keep and bear arms will have limits, and that limit will end where the need to protect national security and public safety begins. Another example that I could give is the First Amendment uses the word no. Congress shall make no law limiting the freedom of speech. But of course there are limits to our freedom of speech. There are places that I can't say certain things. So here's an example of why that should be. If I had an unlimited freedom of speech, well, shouldn't that mean that I can enter a church, brush aside a preacher, take the podium, and say to the congregation, all of this is nonsense. Why are you sitting here listening to this nonsense? This preacher doesn't know what he or she is talking about. But me, in that case, practicing what I would hope is my unlimited freedom of speech would come into conflict with other people's freedoms, their freedom to practice and exercise the religion of their choice. So clearly, my freedom of speech would come into conflict with someone else's freedom as well. So again, this is why there are limits on all of our civil liberties.